right, welcome back. Chalo, okay, welcome back. Hope you had a nice lunch, everybody. Okay, all right. So we can start. Yes, good afternoon and welcome back. Okay, so all right. Are these receptors responsible for climate change sensitization too? Climate change sensitization is your the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, all right. But little sleepy too. You had 1 hour. You didn't sleep during that time. I took a little nap. S. Gautam. Bhai. Okay. Good afternoon, Vivek. Vivek. Yes, people were remembering you before the break. Seem to be a popular person. Yes. All right. Chinmay Prakash. Yes. Very good afternoon. Okay. I know it's so warm, and so let's start. Now, we finished with the rapidly and slowly adapting receptors. We just finished with that, and I want to do a few questions with you. Now, for instance, this is one question which says that see this, that's shown above is the time taken for adaptation by 4 different receptors. Now I said, what are these, if you remember what is adaptation, I said that adaptation is that the stimulus is present but the response reduces over a period of time. Now if you look at this graph over here, you have in this graph, there is the time is taken on the x-axis and the impulses per second. Impulses per second is taken on the y-axis, right? So now if you look at this, now C and D are both very rapidly adapting receptors. These are very rapidly adapting receptors, isn't it? Because what has happened in these cases, in these 2 cases, is that the impulse generation over time has decreased very rapidly. So these are very rapidly adapting receptors. And if you look at A and B, these are slowly adapting receptors. Yes? These are slowly adapting receptors. C and D are rapidly adapting receptors. So the question here which I've asked you is, which of the 4 shown above is the time taken for adaptation by 4 different receptors? The red line is basically, I'm trying to ask you, what is this A over here? Yes, A is which receptor? Is it a Pacinian corpuscle? Is it a Meissner's corpuscle? Hair end organs. These are all examples of very rapidly adapt. These are examples of phasic receptors or rapidly adapting receptors, right? These are examples of rapidly adapting receptors. But the joint capsule receptor, which is meant for position sense, right? The joint capsule receptor, this is meant for position sense. This is a slowly adapting receptor. So A is probably a joint capsule receptor, right? A is joint capsule receptor, which is a slowly adapting. C and D are rapidly adapting receptors. D is probably the Pacinian corpuscle, very, very rapidly adapting receptor. Okay? Next, let's have a look at this question. This says, which of the following is best described as an elongated encapsulated receptor found in the dermal pegs of glabrous skin? Found in the dermal pegs of glabrous skin. These are your Meissner's corpuscle. These are found in dermal pegs of glabrous skin. Let's have a look at this one. If you look at a dermal peg, what does a dermal peg look like? This is a dermal peg, epidermis. This is a dermal peg, and present within the dermal peg is an elongated encapsulated receptor, which is also known as the Meissner's corpuscle. This is known as the Meissner's corpuscle. Right? This is the in the dermal peg, you've got the tactile receptor or the Meissner's corpuscle. Right? Okay. Now, if you look at this, this was a schematic diagram, but I can show you a slide as well. This is a slide where this is a dermal peg here. and present within the dermal peg is a Meissner's corpuscle. It's an elongated and an encapsulated receptor, which are much more numerous in glabrous skin, but also present in hairy skin. These are present, on glabrous skin, right? Okay. Prachi Gupta, Pacinian corpuscle is different from joint capsule receptor. Pacinian corpuscle is present in a joint capsule, but Pacinian corpuscle is for vibration. Joint capsule receptor is for position cells. That is a slowly adapting receptor. I have clarified that at least 3 times before this. Prachi Gupta, don't get confused, right? Okay. Joint capsule receptor is different from Pacinian corpuscle. Sarat Sadhu. Okay. Now, next, let's have a look at this question. Now, this question says, which of the following best describe an expanded tactile receptor? This says, which of the following is the expanded tactile receptor found in the dermis of hairy skin that is specialized to detect continuously applied touch sensation, right? Which of the following is best describes an expanded tactile receptor found in the dermis of the hairy skin that is specialized to detect continuously applied touch sensation? This is going to be the Merkel's discs. Merkel's discs. Okay? All right. This is as far as your next. Let me give you a schematic diagram of which receptors are present in hairy skin and glabrous skin. Hairy skin and glabrous skin. See, if you look at this, this is the glabrous skin here and the hairy skin. You've got Meissner's corpuscle specially present in the glabrous skin, right? Meissner's corpuscle present in the glabrous skin. You have Merkel's discs in hairy as well as glabrous skin. This is also a Merkel's disc here. Yes, but please understand, 60% of the sensory information from fingertips is from Meissner's, right? 60% of the sensory information from the fingertips is by the Meissner's. Right? So from fingertips is going to be Meissner's. So Meissner's, like I told you, if you are asked a question on texture, topogonosis, and even fine touch, your better answer is Meissner's. Even though Merkel's is present in glabrous skin, but Meissner's, 60%, like I said, of the sensory information from the fingertips is from Meissner's. Okay? All right. So this is as far as your Meissner's is concerned. If you look at Pacinian corpuscles have got a deep location. This is the Pacinian corpuscle, which has got a deep location. It is not present superficially. It is located deeply, or it is located in the joint capsules. Right. So you also have the Ruffini's endings and the free nerve endings. Okay. All right. So Darshan Birla, Ruffini's was for prolonged pressure. Prolonged pressure, right? Prolonged pressure. Okay. All right. Poorly adapting receptor is actually an advantage for us, right? Yes, it is. How many pages to leave? That is not mine. Okay. Let's see this. This says, which of the following is an encapsulated receptor? This is an encapsulated receptor, so rapidly adapting, found deep in the skin throughout the body as well as the facial layers, where it detects deep pressure as well as vibration. And the answer is Pacinian corpuscle. Pacinian corpuscle. Okay? Okay. So this is as far as your 4 important questions or 5, 6 important questions are concerned. Okay. Okay. Why not Ruffini for what? Kajal Kumari, Tulsian? What are you saying? Why not Ruffini? For what? Merkel's discs are present in the glabrous as well as the hairy skin, isn't it? All right. So once you've done this, let's go back to our what we were trying to do. Okay. Let's see the next thing here. Okay. Now the next is, all right. The next thing which I'm going to discuss over here is what are the laws of sensory physiology? What are the laws of sensory physiology? Laws of sensory physiology. Now, as far as laws of sensory physiology is concerned, the first one is what is known as the Bell-Magendie law. Bell-Magendie law, right? Laws of sensory physiology, the first one is Bell-Magendie law. Again, has been asked as a question, what is the Bell-Magendie law? Bell-Magendie law states that the dorsal or the posterior horn of the spinal cord, the dorsal or the posterior horn of the spinal cord is sensory, right? Dorsal or the posterior horn of the spinal cord is sensory. That means all the sensory input which comes into the spinal cord enters via the posterior horn. Dorsal or the posterior horn of the spinal cord is sensory. And the ventral or the anterior horn. Ventral or the anterior horn of the spinal cord is motor. That means all the motor output from the spinal cord is via the anterior horn of the spinal cord. All the sensory fibers will enter into the spinal cord from the posterior aspect, and all the motor fibers will leave the spinal cord from the anterior side, right? So this is your Bell-Magendie law. The second one is called the law of projection. What is the law of projection? Bell-Magendie law, dorsal horn is sensory, ventral horn is motor, and the second law of sensory physiology is what is known as the law of projection. Law of projection is responsible for the phantom limb. Phantom limb. This is your law of projection. Now, what is phantom limb? Phantom limb is something, a problem which occurs in amputees. Following an amputation, there is, even the nerve is sectioned. The nerve is also cut. So what happens is, the cut end of the nerve is getting by the release of inflammatory chemicals in the stump. There is going to be release of inflammatory chemicals, right? Inflammatory chemicals which will stimulate the cut end of the nerve. And when the cut end of the nerve is stimulated, the patient feels as though the impulses are arising from the non-existent foot. This is called the phantom limb, right? Phantom limb. And this again has been asked as a question a number of times. What is phantom limb? How do you explain phantom limb? This is law of projection. What is law of projection? Law of projection states that if a nerve is stimulated, anywhere in its course, right? If it is stimulated anywhere in its course, sensation appears to be arising from. Sensation appears to be arising from the site of receptor. Sensation appears to be arising from the site of receptor. right? Site of receptor. If its nerve is stimulated anywhere in its course, sensation appears to be arising from this. That is called the law of projection. Here, after an amputation, the cut end of the nerve, right, following an amputation, the cut end of the nerve is being stimulated. Cut end of nerve is stimulated. Cut end of the nerve is stimulated by the inflammatory chemicals, right? By the inflammatory chemicals in the stomach. And that begins, the patient now starts to feel as though the sensation is arising from the non-existent foot. This is your law of projection. If a nerve is stimulated anywhere in its course, sensation appears to be arising from the site of receptor. That is called the phantom limb. But today we believe that phantom limb is because of the phenomena of. Phantom limb is not due to the law of projection, but phantom limb is better explained. Phantom limb is due to the phenomena of cortical plasticity. It is because of cortical plasticity, right? Phantom limb can be explained not by the law of projection, but today we believe it is because of cortical plasticity. Now, what is cortical plasticity? Let's try and understand this. What is cortical plasticity? Now, cortex is a plastic structure. And what is plastic? Plastic means moldable, right? It's like plasticine, right? Play-doh, which you play with as children, or clay. That is plastic. Cortical plasticity. Cortical plasticity says that the cortex and even thalamus, they have the ability, cortex and even thalamus, they have the ability to form new synapses. The inflammatory chemicals nahi release hoga kya? If there is an amputation, there will be inflammation. Injury anywhere brings about an inflammatory reaction. Basic pathology, yes. So inflammatory chemicals, yes. Cortex and even the thalamus have the ability to form new synapses. That is called cortical plasticity, right? Cortical plasticity. Now, phantom limb is, so if you're asked a question, what is phantom limb due to? And this is phantom limb. What is phantom? Phantom limb is due to. Phantom limb is due to A, is it because of law of projection? Is it because of the law of projection? Or B, is it because of the cortical plasticity? Right? Is it because of law of projection or the cortical plasticity? Your better answer becomes cortical plasticity. This is what the latest theory tells you, that it is because of new synapses which are formed at the level of the cortex. Right? New synapses are formed at the level of the cortex. For example, let me try and explain this to you over here. How can we, sorry. All right, let me try and explain this to you over here. What do I mean by cortical plasticity? See, if you look at if this is what the sensory cortex, right? This is the sensory cortex. Yes, this is a representation. If you remember, sensory cortex is your post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus. Okay? Now, the complete body is represented in the sensory cortex. This is what we look like in the sensory cortex, right? All of us look as beautiful as this in the sensory cortex. Okay? So this is the representation in the sensory cortex. Okay? Now, if you can see this over here, the representation of the leg is on the medial side. This part is used for leg and foot. Can you make that out? Yes, we've got toes here. The leg and the foot are represented in this part of the cortex. This is on the medial aspect. Okay? Medial aspect. Now, supposing there is an amputation. So what happens is, now this part of the leg is gone. So obviously, this area on the sensory cortex is no longer receiving any impulses. So what happens is, now cortical plasticity is that the neighboring areas following amputation, it is the neighboring areas, in this case, which are the neighboring areas in the sensory cortex? Neighboring areas in the sensory cortex. In this case, if you can see which is the neighboring area could be the thigh area, or it could be the trunk area, right? Thigh or the trunk area. The neighboring areas in the sensory cortex form new synapses with the leg area, right? New synapses with the leg area. So what happens is when new synapses are formed, now supposing a sensory stimulus is given over the thigh or the trunk, now new synapses exist between the trunk and the leg. So when a sensory stimulus is given over the trunk area, the patient feels as though the sensation is arising from the leg. That is what is probably responsible for the phantom limb, right? This is what is known as the cortical plasticity, right? Cortical plasticity. Following an amputation, neighboring areas of the sensory cortex form new synapses with the leg area or with the amputated part, and these new synapses, so that when those areas are excited, let's say new synapses have been formed between the leg and between, let's say, the thigh and the leg, or between the trunk and the leg areas, then whenever these areas are excited, sensory stimuli are given, patient starts feeling as though the sensation is arising from the non-existent foot. Right? So this is what is meant by cortical plasticity, right? Cortical plasticity. So let's have a look at the question which I was asking you, and that was, what is phantom limb due to? If you are given both the options, is it due to law of projection or is it due to cortical plasticity? The answer is cortical plasticity. Okay? All right. Yes, Trishit Saha, synapses will form the cortex. That is by cortical plasticity. Right? Cortical plasticity. Okay, so this is as far as the law of projection is concerned. Now, so we've done two laws after these are, number one is Bell-Magendie law and law of projection. Bell-Magendie law states that dorsal or the posterior horn of the spinal cord is sensory, ventral or anterior horn is motor. Law of projection responsible for phantom limb, but today we feel that phantom limb, the better answer is cortical plasticity. Nancy Bharat Majidhya, this feeling is not necessarily permanent, but it definitely troubles the amputees for at least a few years after injury. Right? Okay. Still, cortical plasticity, multiple correct answer. Why will they ask you? Cortical plasticity is more recent observation. Okay? All right. Again, Rutvik, Basant Bhai, Kanani, these are variable depending from patient to patient, not necessarily for the whole life of that amputee. Okay. Okay, yes, mirror therapy is done for phantom limb patients. Yes, Orel, absolutely correct, mirror therapy. Now, the next important point here is there are two important laws for intensity discrimination. Laws for intensity discrimination of a stimulus. Laws for intensity discrimination of a stimulus. Right? Laws for intensity discrimination of a stimulus. And the first one here is laws for intensity discrimination of a stimulus. The first one is what is called the Weber-Fechner law. There are two laws for the intensity discrimination of a stimulus. This is Weber-Fechner law. Now, Weber-Fechner law states that the sensation felt, Weber-Fechner law states that the sensation felt is directly proportional to the log of intensity of stimulus. Log of intensity of stimulus, right? Sensation felt is directly proportional to the log of intensity of stimulus. Yes, this Weber-Fechner law states that whatever sensation we feel is not proportional to the intensity, but to the log of intensity of stimulus. Or in other words, The sensation felt is proportional, is equal to, the sensation felt is equal to k log of I, where k is a constant. Sensation felt is equal to k log of I, where k is a constant. This is known as your Weber-Fechner law, right? Weber-Fechner law, right? Now, like I said, sensation felt is directly proportional to not to the intensity, but to the law of intensity. See, what is the importance of this particular law? The importance of this law is, for example, you know that log of 10 is 1. Log of 100 is 2. Log of 1000 is 3. That means if sensation increases by 100 times, isn't it? 10 to 1000 is 100 times increase in sensation, right? If intensity, I should not say sensation here, intensity of sensation. If intensity of the sensation increases by 100 times, sensation felt increases by only 3 times. This is the significance of this law, right? If intensity increases by 100 times from 10 to 1000, the sensation felt is only increased by 3 times. Have you understood? For example, you can see in candlelight, you can see in bright sunlight. That is thousands of times increase in intensity. Right? But sensation that you have felt will be proportional only to the log of intensity, not to the intensity, but to a log of intensity. Have you understood? This is what it says, right? This is what is known as your Weber-Fechner law. If intensity increases times, the sensation felt has not increased by 100 times, it has increased only by 3 times. Because the sensation that you feel is proportional to the log of intensity, not to 2 times beta kaise, 1 into 3 is 3 na, so increase is by 3 times. 1 into 3 is 3, so from 1 to 3, that means it has increased by 3 times. Okay, acha, theek hai, 2 times. Okay. 10 से 1000 is how many times? All right. ठीक है. The point is, it is not increasing by 100 times now. ठीक है? Though the answer is 3 times. You can go back and have a look. It is 3 times, right? Okay. All right. So this is it is not 1 plus 1 beta, Priya Sahu. It is times. So it is a multiplication factor. So it is 3 times. 1 to 3 is 1 into 3 is 3. So if it increases from 1 to 3, it is 3 times. Chalo, okay. Acha, theek hai. Don't bother. It is all right. Whatever way you understood. The point is, the law is this. Sensation felt is k log of I. K log of I. K is a constant. Sensation felt is not proportional to intensity, but to a log of intensity. Right? Log of intensity. Okay, so this is your Weber-Fechner law. The second law for intensity discrimination of a stimulus, we are wasting time on something stupid. It is not important. Important is the law, which is Weber-Fechner law. वो भूल जाओगे, याद क्या रखोगे? कितने times increase था? Not important. What is important is the Weber-Fechner law, which has been asked as a question. Sensation felt will increase, is proportional not to intensity, but to log of intensity. Okay? All right. Now, then you have what is known as the Stevens power law. Stevens Stevens power law. What is Stevens power law? Stevens power law states that the sensation felt is not proportional to intensity, not to a log of intensity, but to a power function of intensity. This states that sensation that is felt is equal to ki to the power a, where k and a are constants. K and a are constants, right? This is called the Stevens power law, right? So there are two laws for intensity discrimination: Weber-Fechner law and Stevens power law, right? Weber-Fechner law and Stevens power law. Weber-Fechner law states that the sensation felt is proportional to log of intensity. Stevens power law states that sensation felt is not proportional to log of intensity, but to a power function of intensity, where that means sensation felt is ki to the power a, where k and a are constants. So we've done 4 laws: Bell-McKenty law, we've done the Bell-McKenty law, and then we did what? Law of projection, then we did the Weber-Fechner law and Stevens. All of them have been asked as questions, right? All of them have been asked as questions. Okay. Next, let's go on to what are the sensory tracts. Let's go on to the sensory tracts. Yes? Chetan, it's better late than never, Hannah. There are these questions have been asked repeatedly, and these are very straightforward questions on asked, right? Ascending or the sensory tracts, right? Sensory. Adarsh KV, good morning. Yes, we are on. We are doing CNS. Can we continue? Ascending or the sensory tracts. Yes, I know, ignore is what I have to, but you know what happens is, Rahul, sometimes I have to look at some genuine doubts. There may be some genuine doubts. So I can't ignore that as well. So it's a very judicious, it's something which I have to do some judiciously. I have to look at some genuine doubts, which may be there. And in this number of messages that are being typed, sometimes genuine doubts get lost. That is why I said keep your typing to a minimum. Try and not react to everything. Put in your genuine doubts so that we can, so that our learning process is better, isn't it? All right. Okay, so let's go on to the sensory or the ascending tracts. Now, as far as sensory or ascending tracts is concerned, this is divided into 3 major systems. And the 3 major systems is the posterior column, spinothalamic tracts, and the spinocerebellar tracts. Right? Spinocerebellar tracts. Right? Posterior column, spinothalamic tracts, and the spinocerebellar tracts. So these are your 3 major divisions. Posterior column, spinothalamic tracts, and the spinocerebellar tracts. Now, if I look at the posterior column, first let's have a look at the spinocerebellar tracts. Now, spinocerebellar tracts, these are meant for the spinocerebellar tracts, these are meant for unconscious proprioception. These are meant for unconscious proprioception. And what is unconscious proprioception? Unconscious proprioception is that means the proprioceptive input which is Proprioceptive input, which enters the cerebellum, is unconscious proprioception, what you are not aware of. That is called unconscious proprioception. Remember, conscious proprioception is carried by posterior column, what you are aware of. What you are aware of, what you are conscious of, that is by posterior column. What you are not aware of is by the spinocerebellar tract. That is called your unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception. Right? Now, unconscious proprioception, you have the dorsal tract. This is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Right? You also have what is known as the cuneo-cerebellar. These are from the lower limb, dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar tract. You have the cuneo-cerebellar tract, which is from the upper limb, right? Upper limb. This is similar to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, right? This is the cuneo-cerebellar tract, which is from the upper limb, right? This is as far as your spinocerebellar tract, like I said, is meant for unconscious proprioception. Yes, unconscious proprioception. Conscious proprioception is carried by the conscious proprioception is carried by the posterior column. Yes. Unconscious proprioception, spinocerebellar tract. So you have a dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the ventral spinocerebellar tract. This is from the lower limbs. From the upper limb, you've got the cuneo-cerebellar tract and the rostral spinocerebellar tract. Rostral spinocerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract is carrying impulses from the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organs. Ventral spinocerebellar tract from only the Golgi tendon organs. Cuneo-cerebellar tract from muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organs. Rostral spinocerebellar tract from the Golgi tendon organs. Please remember, what is analogous to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract from the upper limb is cuneo-cerebellar, and what is from the analogous to the ventral spinocerebellar from the upper limb is rostral spinocerebellar. So these are your spinocerebellar tracts. Spinocerebellar tracts. Yes, this is meant for unconscious proprioception from the lower limb. This is muscles of dorsal spinocerebellar and ventral spinocerebellar. From the upper limb, cuneo-cerebellar and rostral spinocerebellar. Dorsal and cuneo-cerebellar carry impulses from muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organ. Ventral and rostral spinocerebellar carry impulses only from the Golgi tendon organ. Okay? This is as far as your spinocerebellar tract is concerned. Next, let's also know, see, rostral is from upper limb, ventral is from lower limb. Have you understood? Lower limb, you have two, dorsal and ventral. From upper limb, you have the cuneo-cerebellar and the rostral spinocerebellar. Now, for posterior column, what are the sensations carried by the posterior column? Minidar, what is unconscious proprioception? Unconscious means what you are not aware. You are not conscious of that, isn't it? For instance, if I ask you what is the position of your elbow, right? You are aware of the position, that is conscious proprioception. So that is my posterior column, yes? But what the position of, you're not aware of position of every muscle, every joint in the body, right? So what you're not aware of is carried by the posterior column. That is the unconscious, what you are not aware of. Conscious is position sense that you are, position sense. One is aware of. That is called conscious proprioception. Posterior columns will carry fine touch, right? Vibration, localization, 2-point discrimination, 2-point discrimination, and stereognosis. Stereognosis. What is stereognosis? Stereognosis is the ability to detect an object by feeling its size and shape. What is stereognosis? This is the ability to detect an object. Ability to detect an object by feeling its size and shape. Yes? If you remember, how did we, by feeling its size and shape? If you remember, how did we test for stereognosis in a patient? Sensory system examination. You asked him to close his eyes, and you placed something in his hand, and you said, "Tell me, what is it?" And then he feels for it, and he says, "This is a pen." Have you understood? So that is stereognosis, ability to feel and to detect an object by feeling its size and shape. So this is as far as the posterior column is concerned. So we've done spinocerebellar, which is unconscious proprioception. Posterior column is conscious proprioception, fine touch, vibration, localization, 2-point discrimination, and stereognosis. Let's have a look at the spinothalamic tracts. Now, as far as the spinothalamic tracts is concerned, spinothalamic tract is divided into two. What are the spinothalamic tracts? Spinothalamic tracts, like I said, are divided into two. There is a lateral spinothalamic tract and there is an anterior spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract is meant for pain and temperature. Pain and temperature. The anterior spinothalamic tract, this is meant for crude touch, itch, tickle. Crude touch, itch, tickle, sexual sensations. These are carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract, right? Anterior spinothalamic tract, crude touch, itch, tickle, and the sexual sensations. Okay? This is carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Now, up till now, we have talked of pressure. Pressure has got a dual transmission. Pressure has got a dual transmission. Detection of pressure is by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Detection of pressure. This is by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Detection of pressure is also known as paragnosis. Detection of pressure is by the anterior spinothalamic tract. But the ability to judge the different degrees of pressure, is by the posterior column. So pressure has got a dual transmission. Detection of pressure, that is paragnosis, is by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Baro means pressure, gnosis means detection. But the ability to judge the different degrees of pressure is going to be by the posterior column. So if you have a question which says, in a posterior column lesion, what will happen to barognosis? Baroganosis is present or absent. Posterior column lesion, baroganosis. Baroganosis will be present because baroganosis is not carried by posterior column. It is in fact carried by the anterior spinal thalamic tract. I've not told. Baroganosis. This is going to be present. But the question says, what will happen to graph aesthesia? What is graph aesthesia? What is graph aesthesia? Supposing I take the forearm of the patient and I write something with the blunt edge of the pen. I write something over here and I ask him, what is it I've written? Or if I take my finger and write something. That is called graph aesthesia. Graph aesthesia will be absent. Why will graph aesthesia be absent? Because localization will be lost. Localization is lost, right? Localization is lost. That is what is going to happen. Graph aesthesia will be absent because localization will be lost, right? This is what happens in a posterior column lesion, right? Okay, so let's see this. Once again, spinocerebellar tracts, unconscious proprioception, posterior column, conscious proprioception, fine touch, vibration, localization, 2-point discrimination, stereognosis. Spinal thalamic tract, lateral spinal thalamic tract, pain, temperature, anterior spinal thalamic tract, crude touch, itch, tickle, sexual sensations, and baroganosis. But the ability to judge the different degrees of pressure is by the posterior column. If there is a posterior column lesion, what will happen to baroganosis? Baroganosis will be present because that is carried by the anterior spinal thalamic. Graph aesthesia will be absent because localization will be lost. Okay? All right. Okay. Baroganosis, Rahul Chaudhary, is carried by anterior spinal thalamic tract. Baroganosis is by the anterior spinal thalamic tract. So if there is a posterior column lesion, baroganosis is intact. Because it is not carried by posterior column but by the anterior spinal thalamic. Okay? All right. Next, let's go on to the course. Let's go on to details of the posterior columns. Yes, let's see posterior column here. Posterior column, and posterior column is also known as the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, right? Dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, right? Now, let us see what is the course of this tract. And for that, I'm going to draw a midline here. Yes. Okay. This is a cross section of the spinal cord here. Yes. Okay. Dorsal root ganglion, and this is the anterior root together, which forms the spinal nerve. ठीक है? अरे बेटा graph aesthesia क्या है? आपको सब लोग बता रहे हैं. Supposing, let's say, you take somebody's forearm, yes, and ask him to close his eyes, and you write something here, isn't it? You write something here with your fingertip. Yes, you write something here. Maybe write a letter A, or maybe whatever, right? Whatever you write here, and ask him क्या लिखा है. तो उसने बता दिया आपको क्या लिखा है. That is called graph aesthesia. Graph aesthesia is possible if localization is intact. और localization कौन सा tract लेके जाता है posterior column. So if there is a posterior column lesion, graph aesthesia will be absent because localization will be lost. That is what it is trying to tell you. Okay. Now this is the cross section. So we are going to discuss what is the course of the tract. And since this is an ascending tract, it goes from below upwards, isn't it? So we are trying to build up the tract. This is a cross section of the spinal cord. You have a posterior root, you have the dorsal root ganglion, and you've got the anterior root. Together they form the spinal nerve. Now, the first order sensory neuron. If you remember, I've discussed it with you that the first order sensory neuron is the dorsal root ganglion cell. This is the DRG cell, dorsal root ganglion cell. This is dorsal root ganglion cell. Dorsal root ganglion cell. This is the first order sensory neuron. And if you remember, we've discussed this. This is known as a pseudo-unipolar neuron. I discussed this in the first class that this is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Yes. This is your dorsal root ganglion cell, which is a first order sensory neuron, which is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. It has got two processes, a peripheral and a central process. It looks as though it has one process, but in fact, it has got two processes, peripheral and central. So when I give a sensory stimulus on the skin, like for instance, vibration, yes, then the action potential is generated in the first node of Ranvier. We've done that already last time. And this action potential will jump from node to node. This will jump from node to node. It will go via this peripheral process and via the central process towards the spinal cord, right? Towards the spinal cord, right? So if I give a sensory stimulus on the skin, action potential is generated in the first node of Ranvier, then it goes by saltatory conduction, first via the peripheral process, then via the central process into the spinal cord. This is your DRG cell, dorsal root ganglion cell, which is the first order sensory neuron. Now, the central process which enters into the spinal cord does not synapse anywhere. It enters into the posterior column and ascends upwards. No synapse anywhere. Ascends upwards. Right? Ascends upwards, and the first synapse is in the medulla. In the medulla, you have two nuclei, nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. This is the first synapse that you see. First synapse will be in the medulla, the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. From this nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus in the medulla now arises, this is what is known as the second order sensory neuron. And this second order sensory neuron, it now crosses over to the opposite side. So crossing to the opposite side is being done by first, second, or third. The crossing to the opposite side is done by the second order sensory neuron. The second order sensory neuron, after crossing, the second synapse will be in the thalamus. After crossing over to the opposite side, it forms what is known as the medial lemniscus. This is known as the medial lemniscus. Second synapse is in the thalamus. And the nucleus of the thalamus with which it forms a synapse is what is known as the ventero-postero lateral nucleus, or also known as the ventero-basal complex. Ventero-posterolateral nucleus, or the ventero-basal complex. And from here arises the third order sensory neuron, right? This is the third order sensory neuron, which now goes into the sensory cortex. It goes into the sensory cortex. This is the path of the posterior column. Let's see this once again. Posterior column, let's see this. First order sensory neuron is the DRG cell, or the dorsal root ganglion cell, which is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. The central process enters into the spinal cord, goes into the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, ascends upwards. The first synapse is in the medulla, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus. From the nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus, you have the second order sensory neuron, which now crosses over to the opposite side. It synapses in the opposite side thalamus. Which nucleus of the thalamus? The ventero-posterolateral nucleus, also known as the ventero-basal complex. From here arises the third order sensory neuron, which now ascends to the sensory cortex. This is your posterior column, right? Posterior column. Now, as far as the sensory cortex is concerned, a little more detail about the sensory cortex. Now, sensory cortex is the post-central gyrus. Sensory cortex is the post-central gyrus. This is Brodmann's areas 3, 1 and 2. 3, 1 and 2. In the sensory cortex, you have a sensory homunculus. I showed you a diagram of the sensory homunculus. Right? Sensory homunculus, which is also known as the grotesque figure. Grotesque figure of Penfield and Rasmussen. Penfield and Rasmussen. Right? Grotesque figure of Penfield and Rasmussen. What is a sensory homunculus? The complete body is represented in the sensory cortex. It is also known as the figure of Penfield and Rasmussen. Sensory homunculus. Yes. Now here, the sensory homunculus, the complete body is represented, but the representation is not proportional to size. More sensitive areas have a large cortical representation. More sensitive areas have a large cortical representation. Right? More sensitive areas have a large cortical representation. For example, the face area, which includes including the lips, they have a large representation, isn't it? Because the face area is a very sensitive area. More sensitive areas, face has got a very large representation. Hands and fingers have a large cortical representation. Why? Because these are extremely sensitive areas. Yes? But the trunk, which is not such a small, which is not a very sensitive area, it has a small cortical representation. Small cortical representation, right? So this is what is meant by this is what happens in the sensory homunculus. Larger, the more sensitive areas have got a large cortical representation, but the less sensitive areas, which is like, for instance, the trunk, has got a small cortical representation, right? So again, let's see this. As far as the sensory cortex is concerned, this is the post-central gyrus, Brodmann's areas 3, 1, and 2, and there is a sensory homunculus, where the complete body is represented, but the representation is not proportional to size. It is more sensitive areas have got a large cortical representation. Now, the first order sensory neuron, like I said, is the dorsal root ganglion cell. First synapse is in the medulla, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus. Second order sensory neuron arises in the medulla, crosses over to the opposite side. After crossing, it forms what is known as the medial lemniscus. It forms the medial lemniscus after it crosses over to the opposite side. And these fibers of the second order sensory neuron synapse in the thalamus. From the thalamus, you get the third order sensory neuron, which ascends to the cortex and terminates in the cortex. Right? This is as far as your posterior column is concerned. Now let us see arrangement of the fibers in the posterior column. Right? Arrangement of the fibers in the posterior column. Arrangement of the fibers in the posterior column. Now, remember, this is an ascending tract. The tract starts from below and it moves upwards. It's an ascending tract. So if I take a cross-section of the spinal cord at sacral level, I have only the sacral fibers. Yes, only sacral fibers will be present. Then as we move upwards, the lumbar fibers will come and join on the lateral side of sacral. So if I take a cross-section at the lumbar level, I will find sacral fibers which are medial most, and lateral to the sacral fibers will be lumbar fibers. Have you understood? Remember, it's an ascending tract, right? So as the tract moves upwards, the lumbar fibers will come and join onto the lateral side of sacral. Right? As we move upwards, the thoracic fibers will come and join. Now, thoracic will come and join onto the lateral side of lumbar. So if I take a cross section of the spinal cord at the thoracic level, I have sacral fibers which are medial most, lumbar fibers which are lateral to sacral. Lateral to lumbar will be thoracic fibers. Yes. And as we move upwards, now the cervical fibers will come and join onto the lateral side of the tract. So if I take a cross section at cervical level, I will have sacral fibers medial most, lateral to sacral is lumbar, lateral to lumbar is thoracic, and lateral to thoracic is cervical. So it is a medial to lateral arrangement. Sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical. Sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical. Right. Sacral and lumbar fibers are together known as fasciculus gracilis. Fasciculus gracilis, or the tract of Gall. Fasciculus gracilis, or the tract of Gall. Thoracic and cervical fibers are known as fasciculus cuneatus, which is also known as the tract of Burdach. Tracts of Gall and Burdach. Fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, right? Remember, C for cervical, C for cuneatus. Cervical fibers are cuneatus, right? Lumbar fibers, sacral and lumbar fibers in gracilis. Thoracic and cervical fibers in cuneatus. Okay? So this is your Arrangement of fibers of the posterior column: sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical. Now, there was a question which was asked, which is a tract which is specific for, stereognosis, tract which is specific for stereognosis. Is it going to be fasciculus gracilis, or is it going to be fasciculus cuneatus? Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, which is a tract which is specific for stereognosis. Fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus. Now, if I have to choose between the two, though stereognosis is carried by posterior column, yes, but if I have to choose between, and these are both are posterior columns, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus are both posterior columns. Which is a tract which is going to be specific for stereognosis? Fasciculus cuneatus. Why? Because when I do stereognosis, I use my hands. And which are the fibers from my hands? That is thoracic and cervical. C for cervical, C for cuneatus. So the tract which is specific for stereognosis is fasciculus cuneatus. Right? Fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus cuneatus is also known as the tract of Burdach. I've given it over here. I've written it here. Tract of Burdach. Okay? You're using your hands. So the tract which is specific for stereognosis is fasciculus cuneatus. Okay? All right, so this is as far as your tract posterior column is concerned. Has everybody got the posterior column? Any questions so far? Has everybody got the posterior column? Any questions so far? Let me show you the sensory homunculus. Let me show you the sensory homunculus once again. This is what the sensory homunculus looks like. Yes? This is what the sensory homunculus looks like, right? Very large area for the eyelid, face, lips, jaw, all this is very large area. Then hands and the fingers will have a very large cortical representation, but the trunk has a very small cortical representation, right? So this is what a sensory homunculus looks like. Okay? This is what a sensory homunculus looks like. Okay? Tract of Gall is fasciculus gracilis. Saurabh, Gall is gracilis and Burdach is cuneatus. Burdach is cuneatus. Yes. Now, this is as far as your sensory homunculus. Okay. Now, like I told you, the fibers, once they cross over to the opposite side, they form. Once they cross over to the opposite side, Burdach is cuneatus, right? Cuneatus. Once they cross over to the opposite side, they form the medial lemniscus. They form the medial lemniscus. Now, arrangement of fibers in the medial lemniscus is arrangement of fibers in the medial lemniscus is completely different from the posterior column. In medial lemniscus, the arrangement is anterior to posterior arrangement. It is not a medial to lateral, it is anterior to posterior. So here the sacral fibers in the medial lemniscus lie anteriorly. Sacral fibers in the posterior column were medially, but in the medial lemniscus, the arrangement is going to be different. Now, sacral fibers which were medially placed, they cross over, they twist, and they lie anteriorly. Right? Similarly, behind the sacral is lumbar, behind the lumbar is thoracic, and behind this thoracic is cervical. So in the medial lemniscus, it is an anterior to posterior arrangement, And in the posterior column, it was a medial to lateral arrangement. When they cross over to the opposite side, now sacral fibers lie anterior-most. Behind the sacral is lumbar, then thoracic, and then cervical. This is the arrangement of fibers in the medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus, right? Okay. In the case of the posterior column, the arrangement is sacral fibers will be lie medial most, then lateral to sacral is lumbar, lateral to lumbar is thoracic, lateral to thoracic is cervical. It's a medial to lateral arrangement. Please understand, it is an ascending tract. So as the tract moves upwards, fibers from the upper half will join on the lateral side of the tract. Sacral and lumbar fibers are pushed medially. Thoracic and cervical lie laterally in the posterior column, in the spinal cord. But once it reaches the medulla, the fibers from the second order sensory neuron cross over to the opposite side. And once they cross over to the opposite side, they form the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus, the arrangement of fibers in the medial lemniscus is different from posterior column. Posterior column is in the spinal cord. Medial lemniscus, now the arrangement is different. Now what happens is, now the arrangement is anterior to posterior. So it is sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical. This is how the fibers are arranged. Okay? Now this is the posterior column. Okay? Let's go on to the spinothalamic tract. Chalo, is everybody okay with this? Next, let's go on to the spinothalamic tract. Now let's see spinothalamic tract. Now again, we will see the course of the spinothalamic tract. We'll build up this tract as well. If you take a section of medulla, fibers don't cross. So what's that? So end. Okay, I got it. Spinothalamic tract. Spinothalamic tract. So just like we have discussed the posterior column, we'll also discuss the spinothalamic, and we will build up the tract from below upwards. Yes? Okay. After decussation, Farooq MD, it becomes, I like the name Farooq MD. This becomes the medial lemniscus after decussation. Okay, all right. Now, when you look at the spinothalamic tract, the same way we are going to build up the tract here. Cross section of the spinal cord. Okay? So this is the dorsal root ganglion, anterior root. Okay. Now the first order sensory neuron, the first order sensory neuron, which we've done so many times now, is the dorsal root ganglion cell, which we have already discussed. This is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. This is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So here is the cell body. Looks as though it has one process. Yes. But in fact, it has got two, one which goes towards the skin and the other which goes towards the spinal cord. Okay? Now, when I give a stimulus on the skin, it could be pain, temperature, crude touch, the action potential arises in the first node of Ranvier, then jumps from node to go towards the spinal cord. This is your first order sensory neuron. First order sensory neuron, right? The spine, there's a peripheral process and there is a central process. Now, if you remember the posterior column, the first order sensory neuron, it terminates in the medulla, nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. The first synapse is in the medulla, no synapse at the level of the spinal cord. But in the case of the spinothalamic tract, the first synapse is in the dorsal horn itself. Where is the first synapse? First synapse in the case of the spinothalamic tract, this is in the dorsal horn of spinal cord. Dorsal horn of spinal cord at level of entry. At level of entry into the spinal cord. At level of entry into the spinal cord. Or 1 to 2 levels above. 1 to 2 levels above. Harica, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus are at the level of medulla. These are cell bodies which are present at the level of the medulla. After that, you have the axons of these cell bodies which cross over to the opposite side. Harika Bhaskar. Okay? Now, in the case of the spinothalamic tract, so first synapse of posterior column was in the medulla, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus. But the first synapse in the spinothalamic tract is in the dorsal horn itself, either at the level of entry into the spinal cord or 1 to 2 levels up, 1 to 2 levels above. From here arises the second order sensory neuron, which crosses over to the opposite side and then ascends upwards. Please remember, in the posterior column also, the crossing was done by the second order sensory neuron. In the spinothalamic tract, it is also by the second order sensory neuron, but the level of crossing in both the cases is completely different. Posterior column, the level of crossing is the medulla. Here, the level of crossing is either at the level of entry into the spinal cord or 1 to 2 levels above. Okay? Now, these fibers will ascend upwards. They ascend upwards and they go into the thalamus. They enter into the thalamus. So second synapse will again be in the thalamus, and the nucleus of the thalamus which is involved, ventero-posterolateral nucleus. So this is where you get the second synapse. From here arises the third order sensory neuron. To go into the sensory cortex. To go into the sensory cortex, right? Same sensory cortex, post-central gyrus, areas 3, 1, and 2, yes, where you have a sensory homunculus. So this is what the spinothalamic tract looks like. First order sensory neuron is the dorsal root ganglion cell. First synapse is in the dorsal horn, either at the level of entry into the spinal cord or 1 to 2 levels above. The second synapse is the second order sensory neuron crosses over to the opposite side and it reaches the thalamus. Thalamus is ventro-posterolateral nucleus. From here arises the third order sensory neuron, which now goes up to the sensory cortex. Goes up to the sensory cortex. Let us see the arrangement of the fibers in this tract. Now, this is where arrangement of fibers in the tract. This is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Right? This is the lateral spinothalamic tract. And you have the anterior spinothalamic tract here. This is the anterior spinothalamic tract. Remember, lateral spinothalamic tract is meant for pain and temperature. Anterior spinothalamic tract, crude touch, itch, tickle, sexual sensations, barogonosis. Okay? Now, what is the arrangement of the fibers? Now, remember, these fibers, this tract is formed by fibers which have already internal capsule. Shrikant, we will do it. Hang on, listen to what is being done. Now, these fibers which cross over to the opposite side, they will form the tract. Yes? So if I take a cross section at the sacral level, only the sacral fibers are present. Now, as you move upwards, the lumbar fibers will cross and they will come and join onto the medial side of sacral, because these are crossing and joining the tract. So if I take a cross section, at the lumbar level, what do I find? I will find the sacral fibers will be laterally placed and medial to sacral is going to be lumbar. As we move upwards, the thoracic fibers will come and join onto the medial side of lumbar. So if I take a cross section of the spinal cord at the thoracic level, I have sacral fibers which are laterally placed. From here you have the lumbar. Medial to sacral is lumbar and medial to lumbar is thoracic. If you go on to the cervical level, if I take a cross section of cervical level, you have sacral fibers which are lateral most, then medial to sacral is lumbar, medial to lumbar is thoracic, medial to thoracic is cervical. So it is a lateral to medial arrangement. Okay? अरे बेटा ये है ना second order sensory neuron. Second order sensory neuron is here. The second in this tract is here, dorsal horn itself. Okay. STT is spinothalamic tract. Suzanne Christine Pala, this is spinothalamic tract. Okay. So arrangement of fibers here is the lateral to medial arrangement. Posterior column, if you remember, it was a medial to lateral arrangement. You had sacral fibers, lumbar fibers, thoracic and cervical. Here, sacral fibers are lateral most, then lumbar, then thoracic, and then cervical. Right? So this is the arrangement of fibers in the spinothalamic tract. See, what is the clinical importance over here? Let's have a look at the clinical importance here. And that is, if you look at spinal tumors can be broadly classified into two types. There are medullary spinal tumors and the extramedullary spinal tumors. Medullary and the extramedullary spinal tumors. Yes. So if there is a medullary spinal tumor here, that means this is a medullary spinal tumor. So what is the type of sensory loss that this patient is going to have? Medullary spinal tumors will compromise the cervical fibers first, then the thoracic, then the lumbar, and then the sacral fibers. So that means in a medullary spinal tumor, it is going to be a descending. This is a descending sensory loss. Cervical area will be affected, cervical fibers will be affected first, then thoracic, then lumbar. So it's a sensory, descending sensory loss, descending loss of pain and temperature, right? This is a descending loss of pain and temperature. If it is an extramedullary spinal tumor, that means it's coming from outside the spinal cord. If this is an extramedullary spinal tumor, now the sensory loss will be first of the sacral fibers, then lumbar, then thoracic, and then cervical. So that means this will be an ascending sensory loss. Ascending sensory loss of pain and temperature. Have you understood? This is why, see, which are the fibers which are getting compromised here? If it is a medullary tumor which arises from within the spinal cord, it will first impinge on the fibers which are placed medially. Which are the fibers which are placed medially in the lateral spinal thalamic tract? Cervical, thoracic, isn't it? So the sensory loss will be first in the cervical area, then in the thoracic, then in the lumbar, and then in the sacral area. So in medullary spinal tumors, it is a descending sensory loss. Extramedullary spinal tumors, which are coming from outside, they will affect the sacral fibers first. So sensory loss will be first in the sacral area, then the lumbar area, and then the thoracic, and then so it's an ascending sensory loss. Okay? Okay. Abhishek, why opposite arrangement? Because the tracts are completely different from each other. Posterior column forms the tract, but the crossing is at the level of the medulla. Spinothalamic tracts, they cross and then they form the tract. So there's a basic difference here, isn't it? So this is as far as this is as far as your arrangement of fibers is concerned. Even in the anterior spinothalamic tract, which is meant for crude touch itch, again, the arrangement is the same. Sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical. It's a lateral to medial arrangement. Posterior column, medial to lateral arrangement. Okay? All right. Okay. Spinal tumors, like I said, could be medullary or extramedullary. If it is a medullary spinal tumor, it's a descending sensory loss. If it's an extramedullary spinal tumor, it's an ascending sensory loss. Okay. Graphesthesia will also be lost in lesion of spinal thalamic. A tumor which arises from within the spinal cord, that is a medullary spinal tumor, will affect the cervical fibers first, then the thoracic, then the lumbar. So it's a descending loss, sensory loss, loss of pain and temperature. Extramedullary spinal tumors, ascending sensory loss. Kushpreet cord, what is 1 to 2 levels? And the first synapse is in the dorsal horn or at the level of entry, or 1 to. You remember spinal cord is divided into levels? Yes? So at 1 or 2 segments or levels, one and the same thing. Okay. Now somebody said, tell about the homunculus. You can have a look at the homunculus once again. This is the sensory homunculus. This is in the post-central gyrus. Very large representation for the face and the lips. Yes, and a face, lips, hands, fingers, small representation from the trunk. Okay. Okay. Let me just explain what you mean by 1 to 2 levels above. See, if you look at the spinal cord is divided into segments now. Right? You have the lumbar segments, the sacral segments, the thoracic segments. So when you have a fiber of the spinothalamic tract which enters into the spinal cord, so either it synapses at the same level, or it can climb 1 or 2 levels and then synapse in the dorsal horn. Have you understood? That is what is meant by 1 to 2 levels above. Is that clear? Okay. See, Harika Bhaskar, we talk of medullary tumors affecting the lateral spinothalamic tract because the easiest sensations to sort of distinguish are pain and temperature. So the effect on pain and temperature is much more pronounced as far as medullary tumors are concerned. In the case of posterior columns, such distinction, whether it's descending or ascending, is not easy to see. So it is the descending or ascending sensory loss of pain and temperature, which becomes important. Same side, Sheikh Ahmed, beta, same side. Crossing is done by the second order after synapsing. Okay? All right. चलो ये किसने बोला इसमें से अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन और लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन बोल दो ये क्या बात कर रहे हैं, ये मोटर न्यूरॉन्स हैं क्या? These are sensory neurons we are talking about. Sensory pathways. यहाँ पे मोटर न्यूरॉन कहाँ से आएगा? क्या कर रहे हो? असेंडिंग ट्रैक्ट्स हैं, असेंडिंग ट्रैक्ट सेंसरी हैं, मोटर न्यूरॉन्स डिसेंडिंग होते हैं, ऊपर से नीचे आते हैं, कॉर्टेक्स से स्पाइनल कॉर्ड में जाते हैं, सेंसरी ट्रैक्ट स्पाइनल कॉर्ड से कॉर्टेक्स में जाते हैं। चलो ठीक है, okay, yes, both have anteroposterolateral neurons. Now the next part here is, let's go on to the next one. Now when you look at pain is carried by lateral spinal thalamic tract, and there are two types of pain. Which are the two types of pain? The two types of pain are the fast pain and the slow pain. मैम इन ट्रैक्ट्स में अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन और लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन बता दीजिए कौन सा है? क्या बात करते जी? ओके, फास्ट पेन एंड स्लो पेन. Okay. Fast pain and slow pain. So let's see, there are two types of pain. Chalo, let's concentrate. Bas ho gaya. Fast pain and slow pain. Now, what is fast pain and slow pain? See, pain has got a dual transmission. Pain has got a dual transmission. Very common experience, and that is the moment you touch something hot, there is a sharp pain that you feel which makes you withdraw your hand. That is called fast pain. Right? But because your hand gets burnt, the pain that you feel is called the slow pain. So pain has a dual transmission. Yes, pain has a dual transmission. Pain has a dual transmission. So there is a fast pain and there is a slow pain. Right? Fast pain and a slow pain. This has got a dual transmission. Now, fast pain, this is also known as a sharp pain. This is also known as a sharp pain. This is also known as a pricking pain. Sharp pain, pricking pain, right? Fast pain is also known as a sharp pain. Whenever you touch something hot, sharp pain, which makes you withdraw your hand. So this is sharp pain, pricking pain. This is also known as a stabbing pain. This is known as a stabbing pain. This is also known as an epicritic pain. Epicritic pain. This is also known as the good pain. Why is it known as the good pain? How can pain be good? How can pain be good? This is because, why is it known as the good pain? Because this is responsible for the flexor. This is responsible for the flexor withdrawal response. This is responsible for the flexor withdrawal response. This is known as the good pain. This is responsible for the flexor withdrawal response. This is your sharp pain, pricking pain, stabbing pain, epicritic pain, or also known as the good pain. Good pain. Then slow pain. Slow pain is also known as, this is also known as a dull pain. This is also known as a dull pain. This is known as an aching pain. This is also known as the throbbing pain. Throbbing pain. Yes. Fast pain is it's a localized pain. It is very well localized pain. One thing which I forgot to add, please remember this is also localized pain, very well localized. Yes. So this is dull, slow pain is dull pain, aching pain, throbbing pain. This is also known as a burning pain. Has been asked as a neat question. Burning pain. This is also known as the bad pain. Why is it known as the bad pain? Because this slow pain is associated with autonomic symptoms. This is known, it is associated with autonomic symptoms. You know that pain can be associated with tachycardia. It can be associated with increase in blood pressure. It can be associated with vomiting. Have you understood? So it is associated with autonomic symptoms. That is known as the bad pain. Yes. This is also known as the protopathic pain. When I say protopathic pain, that means it is basically associated with some sort of tissue injury. Protopathic pain. And localized pain, this is also known as a diffuse pain. Slow pain is much more diffuse. It is not very well localized. These are important synonyms for slow pain and fast pain. Let's see this once again. What is fast pain? Fast pain is known as a sharp pain, pricking sensation, stabbing sensation, epicritic pain. Why epicritic pain? What is this name? Epicritic because fast pain is carried by A delta fibers. This is carried by the A delta fibers. A delta fibers are myelinated. Slow pain is carried by the C fibers, which are unmyelinated. So in terms of evolution, the A delta fibers are much newer. They came later in evolution. They are newer fibers. So that is why it is known as epicritic, what came later in evolution. C fibers are older fibers. They came earlier in evolution, right? So epicritic refers to that. Okay? So this is sharp pain, pricking pain, stabbing pain, epicritic because it's a newer pain carried by A delta fibers which are myelinated. Myelinated are newer fibers in terms of evolution. Good pain, why is it called good pain? Because it is responsible for the flexor withdrawal response. This withdrawal which occurs, yes? Localized pain. When you look at the slow pain, this is dull pain, aching, throbbing, burning, bad pain. Why bad? Because it is associated with autonomic symptoms. Protopathic and diffuse pain, not well localized. Fast pain is carried by A delta fibers, slow pain is carried by C fibers. Fast pain is felt within 0.1 second because it is carried by a myelinated nerve fiber. So it is felt within 0.1 second. Slow pain is felt after 1 second. This is after 1 second, right? The stimulus for the fast pain stimulus for the fast pain. This is stimulus for the fast pain is mechanical or thermal. It is mechanical or thermal. Whereas stimulus for the slow pain is chemical. Neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter for fast pain pathway is glutamate. For slow pain pathway is substance P. Substance P. right? So neurotransmitter is glutamate. Here it is substance P. If you look at how these tracts ascend upwards, protopathic is associated with tissue injury, as well as protopathic means earlier in evolution. It's a protopathic sensation, isn't it? See, the pain is a protective sensation, so it evolved earlier. C fibers developed earlier, A delta fibers developed later. So the sensation carried by C fibers is protopathic or slow pain, which is carried by A delta is epicritic or fast pain. Okay. Now when you look at these fibers, when they ascend upwards, if you see how they ascend upwards, this is A delta fiber, and this is C, A delta fiber and C. The A delta fibers, these are also called the neospinothalamic tract. Why neo? In terms of evolution, came later. They are newer. C fibers are also known as the paleospinothalamic tract. In terms of evolution, came earlier. Together, this is known as the lateral spinothalamic tract. Lateral spinothalamic tract. ठीक है? Lateral spinothalamic tract. ठीक है? Now the paleospinothalamic tract, it gives rise to fibers. The paleospinothalamic tract will give rise to collaterals, and collaterals will excite a number of areas as they ascend upwards. So the C fibers will first excite the reticular formation. And what is this reticular formation? This has a role to play in your sleep-wake cycles. Yes, reticular formation is concerned with sleep-wake cycles, isn't it? If the reticular formation is excited, you are alert and awake. Isn't it? Very common experience when you are in pain, if it is genuine, it is very difficult to sleep, isn't it? Because these pain fibers will excite the reticular formation. Reticular formation in turn keeps you alert and awake. दिव्यानी जिसको नींद आ रहा है, जिसको चाय चाहिए, उसको उसके साथ कोई बैठा है, अगर उसको एक अच्छा सा पिंच देगा, nice pinch that you give your somebody who's sitting next to you, the slow pain fibers are excited. Slow pain fibers will excite the reticular formation. Reticular formation will keep you alert and awake. ठीक है? So अगर नींद आ रही है तो उसका solution क्या है? You know it now, right? Reticular formation will keep you alert and awake. Okay? Now that means basically, if you see this, from the reticular formation, there are fibers which go to the cerebral cortex, right? They go to the cerebral cortex. And this is called ARAS. ARAS. What is ARAS? ARAS is ascending reticular activating system. Ascending reticular activating system. ठीक है? Ascending reticular activating system. Okay. Now, which are these? What is this ascending reticular activating system? This is formed by two areas of the reticular formation. And which are these two areas of the reticular formation? Number one is the raphe-magnus nucleus. Raphe-magnus nucleus, which secretes serotonin. And number two is locus ceruleus. locus ceruleus, which secretes norepinephrine, rapamycin, which secretes serotonin, and locus ceruleus, which secretes norepinephrine. Fibers from the reticular formation will ascend to the cerebral cortex. It will keep you alert and awake. This is called the ascending reticular activating system. Which parts of the reticular formation are involved? Rapamycin nucleus, which is serotonergic, and locus ceruleus, which secretes norepinephrine. Okay? So the pain fibers will stimulate the reticular formation. Which two areas of the reticular formation? Mainly rapamycin nucleus and locus ceruleus. From here, you have neurons which project to the cortex and they keep you alert. They stimulate the cerebral cortex, generalized activation of the cerebral cortex, which keeps you alert and awake. Okay. So slow fibers will give excitatory collaterals to the reticular formation, right? They also give collaterals to what is known as the periaqueductal gray. They give collaterals to what is known as the periaqueductal. Periaqueductal gray. What is periaqueductal gray? This is the gray matter around the aqueduct of Sylvius. What is the significance of periaqueductal gray? We will just discuss that. They also give collaterals to the periventricular areas of hypothalamus. Periventricular areas of hypothalamus. Periventricular areas of hypothalamus, and these periventricular areas of hypothalamus, these are responsible for autonomic symptoms, right? These are responsible for autonomic symptoms. I've already told you that the autonomic symptoms which are associated with pain, tachycardia, increase in blood pressure, vomiting, that is because the pain fibers will excite these periventricular areas, and these periventricular areas of the hypothalamus are involved in autonomic symptoms. They are responsible for the autonomic symptoms. These fibers, both the A delta and the C fibers, will go to the thalamus, right? Ventroposterolateral nucleus. Remember, here is the second synapse. A delta fibers will synapse in the thalamus. From here arises the third order sensory neuron to go into the sensory cortex. And C fibers terminate in the thalamus. So this is the difference between A delta and the C fibers. Let's see them once again. A delta fibers are also I've given you the differences between fast pain and slow pain, right? Now, there are also differences between the A delta and the C fibers. Now, A delta fibers, which are for fast pain, and C fibers, which are meant for slow pain. A delta is known as the new spinothalamic tract because in terms of evolution, it came later. Fast pain is therefore also known as the epicritic pain. In terms of evolution, much later. C fibers are also known as paleospinothalamic tract. Paleospinothalamic tract is older in terms of evolution, and the sensation slow pain, which is also known as protopathic pain. The C fibers give collaterals to three areas. Reticular formation. Reticular formation is responsible for keeping you alert and awake. It gives a collateral to periaqueductal gray. What is aqueduct of Sylvius? Between the third and the fourth ventricle. Anatomy. Periaqueductal gray. This is the gray matter around the aqueduct of Sylvius. What is the significance? We'll do a little later. They also give collaterals to periventricular areas of hypothalamus, which are responsible for autonomic symptoms. And C fibers terminate in the thalamus. Look at A delta. A delta straight away goes into the thalamus, no collaterals to any area, fast pain, right? Straight to the thalamus, from the thalamus to the sensory cortex. C fibers, slow pain, give collaterals to a number of areas, reticular formation, periaqueductal gray, periventricular areas of hypothalamus, and terminate in the thalamus itself. Right? This is the difference between A delta and the C fibers. Okay. Now, as far as the reticular formation was concerned, a little more detail about the reticular formation. I told you, pain fibers excite the reticular formation. Which two areas of the reticular formation? Raphe magnus and locus ceruleus, because these are involved in keeping you alert and awake. Raphe magnus nucleus secretes serotonin. Locus ceruleus secretes norepinephrine. These fibers ascend to the cerebral cortex. They form what is known as the ascending reticular activating system, and they keep the cortex alert. They stimulate the cortex and keep you alert and awake. What is the significance of periaqueductal gray? I will do that with you a little later. Ab bhi karenge Shakti Rana. Third order sensory neuron is this one. This is the third order sensory neuron. From the thalamus to the cortex. In the case of slow pain pathway terminates in the thalamus itself. Right? Okay. Ascending reticular activating system from the reticular formation to the cortex. A delta and C fibers. If it is fast pain, the first order is A delta, second order is also A delta. Slow pain, first order is C and second order is also C. Okay. Chalo. Take a break for it's till 4:20, right? Okay. Vijay Kumar, fast pain not associated. नहीं ना बेटा, मैंने नहीं बोला. So slow pain is associated with autonomic nerve fibers. If C fibers terminate in thalamus, is that the reason why they're not localized? Yes. Paleo-spinothalamic tract has no. See, paleo and neo are part of the same lateral spinothalamic tract. Okay? There is no separate tract. Just the fibers are named differently. Okay. So 15 minutes हो गया ना? 15 minutes. Okay. Ciao. हाँ जी, okay, thank you.